Okay, Oliver Burkeman, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to show up today. And we're going to start you with quite a broad question, and you might need a second to consider it because it's a bit of a strange one for a lot of people. But if there were a creation myth that led you to this moment right now in front of us, what would that story be? And that can include formative experiences, key moments, or any ideas you've encountered along the way.
Wow. Okay. A creation myth. Am I allowed to ask questions about the question?
Sure.
I'd like to, yeah.
What do you think I should take from the phrasing of that question that is different from just asking me about formative events and influences and forces? Like, what's the myth part?
So I draw it from Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which he says is the myth of his life. And the difference between the myth and the narrative, for him at least, is that both of them are in a sense falsehoods, because both of them are narratives that are laid upon experiences that become a teleology in some kind of a way. But he says that the myth, in a sense, reveals a different kind of a truth, because it's the story that you're making now about your past that says something maybe more truthful is a funny word to use, but more truthful than just the things that happened.
So
does that help at all?
I think so. I'll tell you what it makes me want to talk about, and then you can tell me if this fits the box. And if not, I can develop it into a sort of legend involving dragons and
princesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it turns my attention, first of all, to the sense that I think I have had, and to some extent don't have anymore, but only to some extent, of needing to sort of, maybe this is universal, needing to sort of excel in certain ways in order to forestall some kind of serious danger, that like there's a sort of lack of safety which I don't think can be reasonably accounted for just through, my upbringing that was, nobody should say their upbringing was completely great and happy, because it actually that doesn't sustain investigation, but really, very fortunate in all sorts of ordinary circumstantial and psychological ways. A sort of a sense of like being on the back foot and needing to prove something in order to stop something very bad happening, and sort of almost being there and never quite having got there. I don't know if that's just too vague and general and sort of evasive because I'm talking in concepts. Fairly recently, I've become willing to think about this in the context of sort of, intergenerational things, and finding out more about the Jewish side of my family and my grandmother's experiences in the start of Nazi Germany. There's all sorts of things that seem to lend strength to what I'm thinking about there, though I'm very skeptical about the whole idea of these things being relevant to people to whom they didn't happen. So this is the big sort of morass of area that I feel like I want to talk about, but I don't think I've told you a myth, and I'm not sure I've really told you anything at all, but it's a place to start, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've given us, I think you kind of given us a context. Yeah.
You can cut that out when we get to the myth. It makes it sound like it just drips from my...
Well, I mean, people don't always answer this question in a straightforward way, and that's kind of why I like it. Sometimes I think maybe we should review it, but it's also kind of why I like it.
If you want if you want to try to have anything like the kind of depth in these conversations that comes from people's therapy, right? You've got to deal with the fact that it often takes 6 months of that before people are saying anything.
Oh, we can meet people to move faster.
We're only a few minutes in. Just you wait, Oliver.
I guess if I were to reframe it a little bit, Oliver, it would be like you became a guy for whatever reason who was trying to forestall whatever this nebulous fear or danger is with some kind of knowledge, I guess, or some kind of purchase on something. Yeah. How did you become that guy, right? Is this something you can identify back as a young child? Is there, it's like you've made it your life mission to assess theories of life practice? Yeah. It just feels like there's a drive to that, a reason to that.
No, I feel like I want to go through backwards from like, not for an hour, but just like the direction I want to take. I think that I see that was what I was doing for a long time. I think that I've seen through that to some extent only fairly recently as a sort of way of achieving anything. So I think, that sort of security achieved through the intellect is the thing. Now, that's not an answer to where the thing comes from, but the idea that things can sort of be figured out and nailed down, and that's what makes things okay when they are. I think I can remember that going back a long way. I have a strange sort of flashbulb memory when I must, putting the facts of the matter together, have been 5 at infant school in Birmingham for the sort of like 1.5 years that I did that before we moved to the north of England, in which I'm narrating to nobody at all. I'm building something with bricks or something that feels not important, and I also can't remember, but I'm doing something on my own and literally like narrating it. I think speaking out loud. So it sounds wild to me now. And being interrupted because there was something that people had to go and do one by one. I don't know, like having been inspector for head lice or one of these things that always happened in infant school in the 1980s. And or like immunizations. I have a memory they tried to do that. They did that in schools, which strikes me as very strange. But anyway, being interrupted from this moment of like explaining things to a sort of, I don't know what kind of audience, and just experiencing that as kind of outrageous somehow, like a huge rupture in what I was trying to do, and being very upset about it. And, just probably having a quasi tantrum like 5-year-olds do all the time for this reason or that. But that specific reason of being sort of interrupted in the process of trying to kind of use words and use concepts, I think more importantly than words perhaps, to fix something. Again, I'm not telling you where it comes from. I don't really know. I'm not sure I have a good answer to where it comes from, but I remember it being present when I was very little.
So kind of like a narrating of the experience to name it, shape it, and give it some kind of form? Or
maybe hold it at arm's length. I don't know, because I don't really remember what the detail of this was. It wasn't like I don't think it's always sort of anxiety-inducing experiences or scary experiences. It's not that. It's just that like that's how you have ground under your feet. I think I thought for quite a long time. And then I do think one thing just worth saying quickly, it is more of a focus on the sort of professional side of things. But like, I think one of the things I've been very fortunate to get to do, the way I think of it, is to sort of pursue that compulsion or whatever it is so far and in so much detail, and for it to be my day job and to sort of do it in so much range and depth that you kind of begin to exhaust it, right? That you sort of realize that it isn't the whole story. I often think that if I'd sort of landed up in some other job where I only had small opportunities to do this kind of thing, you could spend an entire lifetime completely unaware that it was only one way of seeing the world.
So I was going to ask you, but I think maybe it's more interesting to go slightly deeper than this question. I was going to ask you, what's one of the biggest assumptions that you've made about yourself or about life that's been challenged? But it sounds like you're speaking here to an assumption about naming things or doing things in order to stave off this inevitable catastrophe, or maybe that's the word I'm using to put to it. But that having been shaken recently or seen through, what's beneath that? Like when you investigate that further, when you spent these decades exploring all of this sort of way of reckoning with the world, what's behind that?
Wait, what's behind that way of reckoning, or what's behind starting to see through it?
Yeah, when you see through it, what do you see beyond?
Well, in a way, it sort of is mysterious by definition, right? Because it is getting over, to some extent, an allergy to mystery, perhaps. So, it's not clear. I would almost be disappointed if I ever found a way to put perfect words onto it. I think it does definitely have something to do with sort of I haven't got over a self-consciousness about the sense that I'm speaking in cliches, but I think it has something to do with this. There's a sort of self-worth piece to it, right? There's a sense of like the idea that both I and everything in the world might in some sense be absolutely okay just as it is a kind of an extraordinary, revolutionary thought to me. I've had moments with my partner where she and I are discussing some issue to do with maybe where we're going to live, or our son's education, some sort of big issue, and suddenly realizing in the middle of this that like she has been having this last 20 minutes of conversation talking about things as if the stakes are high without a sort of clenched knot in her gut, right? It's just like, hey, we have to weigh these things, and she's got lots of other problems, but not having this this notion that everything rides on everything, the notion that behind that the sort of world holds you up is what I see beyond that, really.
Are you saying that central or has been central to your experience? It sounds like you're talking about anxiety, like a knot of anxiety that needs to be reckoned with, almost as if everything is everything's as important as everything else.
I think I'm very much talking about anxiety. Yeah. Sometimes in a way, as I say, that feels so canonical that I'm not sure what I've got to add, but that's probably another issue. No, absolutely.
But I think, cliche is interesting, right? Because cliche, on the one hand, is something dismissible, but it's also something that's universal, right? So I don't want to throw it out in a sense for being cliche, but I do think that there is something interesting here about a little boy building bricks, creating a narrative of structure, right? And walking around with a ball of anxiety that needs to be reckoned with. And it became your job to reckon with it with everybody else, right?
Yeah. And to navigate a sort of, to me, fascinating, very compelling question about, to what extent am I just sort of sharing my pain? To what extent am I telling people what works? To what extent am I sort of maybe one step ahead of the archetypal reader of the things I write, just because at least I've got the time and the language facility to sort of probe it a bit more? Are you teaching people? Are you teaching people well because you struggle with this stuff? Are you not teaching people at all? And actually all we really want to do is share our problems. I think about this a lot.
Could you say something about maybe where you are with that? Because let me just take one step back, because my experience of you, and we've just met properly for the first time here, but my experience of you were your columns first in The Guardian, where you're kind of reviewing all of these different models of self-help and productivity and critically evaluating them in a way that I found familiar, like kind of wanting them to be the answer, but also wanting to undermine them in some kind of a way. Yeah. And going through each one. And then your books came out. And now here we are now, right? After your latest book. And do you have any answers to those questions about that you were just asking? You know, is this something I'm just struggling with publicly? Is this something I need to let go of?
I mean, I think where it all leads is the sense that you know, we are all sort of in some fundamental way in the same boat, and that therefore a huge proportion of the sort of, you know, in colloquial terms, therapeutic benefit of the things that I write and hear from people about, which is an important part of the process that I should probably talk about, is just the acknowledgement and the awareness that, like, you know, it's not just you and it's not just me and it's not just them. It always blows my mind when I write an email newsletter where I sort of mention in passing that I got completely overwhelmed by having too much email the other day and decided to do X. I hear from people who are astonished that I ever still get overwhelmed by email. And it's like, how many times do I have to write books and newsletters that are like all about how difficult this stuff is and how I've not got any, you know, perfect answers or anything. I mean, and then secondly, they find that fact really empowering or liberating or something. So I have tried to lean into that a little bit, to the fact that is a valuable thing to be doing for them as well as for me. On the other hand, I do think there's a sort of necessity to push past some resistance I have, or deal with some resistance I have to the idea of having something to teach other people, right? In a way, it's like, it's not necessarily arrogant to feel that you have seen some stuff or figured out some ways of talking about some stuff that might be helpful to other people. It's actually very sort of oddly egotistical, perhaps, in a different way, to feel like you can't possibly assume that role. So there is, I know you'd probably frame this in terms of, what is it? There's a therapy talk way of talking about this, but you have to sort of, when in your context, you know, when a client, patient sort of invests you with something, it's not just a question of dismissing that, right? You've sort of got to, there's a way in which you've got to kind of hold some of that idea of being seen as as an expert or a leader or a guru, at the same time as not turning it into, you know, starting a cult and becoming completely insane through it. And so that is sort of interesting to me, because I do think I have a deep instinct to just self-deprecate to a point that is no longer funny or approachable, but just annoying, and sort of denies people something that would be helpful for them and that would thrill me to be able to offer them, which is like, you know, some useful ways to navigate stuff.
So nice to see your ambivalence hasn't ameliorated over the years.
I mean, there's a whole lot of quotes that I sort of almost collect about, I'm just thinking one of the very famous one is Richard Bach, who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull in the 70s, whatever, who said, and he may not be the originator of it, but he said something like, we teach best what we most need to learn. I think of that all the time. David Brooks quotes somebody else. I don't know where it comes from. I just encountered it in a David Brooks book, that writers are like beggars showing other beggars where we have found bread, right? There's something very moving to me about this kind of, it's a little bit overly humble maybe in some ways, but it's that idea that on the one hand, you have nothing more than anyone else you're writing for, but on the other hand, the thing you do have is fully valuable and you know, worth not disdaining before you've even handed it over to them.
Well, I mean, it's really resonant in the idea of the wounded healer, and you know, there's
right.
The myth of my profession, anyway, for a lot of us is, you know, we become psychotherapists because we're fucked up, and you know, we want to find out. It's all about us, right? And I think there's some truth in that, and obviously, I think, like you say, you also have to own what you've learned along the way in the service that you're providing. But thinking about our listeners and thinking about exactly this kind of work and thinking about, and I think maybe this is what you might be asking also about yourself, how and if people change and what those catalysts of change are, and to kind of branch off of Natalie's question about any basic assumptions that might have changed in you. Can you locate an experience or an idea that shifted your belief system in some way, or even the way in which you behaved in the world? It's probably not going to be inbox zero, but has there been would you say, fundamental characterological shift in some way over the years?
I think so. I'm thinking like, I really want there to have been. So I hope that
it could be a slow burn as well.
I hope that I can say that it's true. Yeah, and I think, just again to sort of embrace the cliche, it really is that idea that recurs all over the place, that it's through acceptance of oneself that the change can happen, or that it's once you are okay with who you are, or a little bit more okay, let's say, with who you are, then that's when you're freer to do things. The way I always characterize it to myself, and then sometimes to audiences, writing or speaking, and you have to hope that they've got exactly the same neuroses as yourself, otherwise it's not going to land, is this sort of realization that in some very fundamental sense, like, I don't need to do anything. That the things that I enjoy, or things I find meaningful to do in work, certainly, talk beyond work, of course, I'm sure you'll want to, but are the kinds of things that, like, I don't have to do in order to, like, there isn't the notion that the stakes are lower than I thought they were. That there's probably a bunch of different ways I could, keep a roof over my head and do all the basics, and that I don't sort of need to be doing what I put at the center of my working life, and how that actually frees up energy and motivation to do it. Like, that has been a big thing for me. And I write in my most recent book, I think I'm fairly honest in that point about saying that this was not a sort of total life change. It was an intellectual epiphany. And like many people, I get those, and then it takes like a decade to begin to sort of embody them in any serious way. But I write about sitting on a park bench in Prospect Park in Brooklyn on feeling even more anxious than usual, more stuff on my plate, trying to figure out what combination of time management techniques I was going to use to get to the end of everything that I needed to get through, and just being struck in a new way by the thought, oh, it's impossible. Oh, right. Okay. Oh, this thing I was trying to do that I had tacitly established as sort of the minimum to feel okay about myself or to earn my spot on the planet. It's just can't, it's actually beyond my maximum. It can't be done. And finding in that real, again, in the short term, intellectual, but still real sort of liberation and motivation to then sort of do a few things that I could do, rather than continue to engage in this drama of, like, if you don't do more than you're capable of, then you haven't done the minimum required, which is just such a ridiculous idea when you try to unpick it. So that too, I think, was an important moment. And these sort of they're two different. Well, tell me what you think about this, but they sort of have two different feels, right? Because one of them is almost building oneself up and saying, like, you're enough without accomplishment, but the other is kind of surrendering to how finite and little that you are, and saying, like, it's just stupid to try to spend your life trying to make 2 + 2 add up to 5.
there's so many places we could go with this. I think there's, because you're talking about paradox. I think really the sense of if you come to terms with the idea that, as sometimes people come up with, we talk about non-dualism quite a bit, like if life is as it should be and meaningless, then it gives you the liberty to create what meaning you want in it, which for some people can feel like a liberation and an invitation to really explore and to expand. And I think for others, it can feel crushing, this idea that, well, if I can't even reach the bare minimum, what's the point? So there's
Right.
And I wonder, well, I would imagine that for those who have similar neuroses or sort of perspectives on life, it could act as a key that unlocks possibility and energy and optimism. I'm curious, in your life, have there been moments where you felt that there's been some kind of disaster where there wasn't an intellectual frame that could rescue you for the time being? So, like, what the disaster might have been, and then how you manage your way through it.
Two things come to mind that I really want to say. One is, just to begin with, that I feel like I find it hard to identify disasters that feel like they've happened to me specifically or to my immediate family specifically, and this sort of makes me nervous because I feel like I'm jinxing things or that they're bound to happen. And I do know closely people to whom things have happened that I would absolutely classify as disasters, and maybe it says something about me that I don't think myself as quite involved in them, but equally, these are family tragedies that happen to other families, so I think it's appropriate that I don't pretend that it's mine in any sense remotely connected to the way that it's theirs. What I am always struck by in myself in those contexts, and I think this is familiar to a lot of people, but is the absence of ambivalence about what one should do. Not about what one should say, which is maybe an interesting distinction, but I've a few times in my life been sort of just on the circumference of terrible things happening where it might be my job to do somebody's laundry for them while a sibling of theirs goes through a sort of almost unimaginable, whatever. You can be different degrees of closeness to it. And I've always been struck by the sense of like that this is somehow beyond conceptualization and intellectual fidgeting, right? It's just kind of, it's obvious. In some sense, it feels good, although that's a strange way to talk about it. And I think in much more minor ways as well, actually, I've written about this. I sort of have this reputation with some friends and family of being good in a crisis, which sounds like wonderfully flattering. And really, it just means that all times that there aren't crises, I'm second guessing myself and being ridiculous and like wondering and trying to issue caveats and worrying if people think the wrong thing about me. And then, just a small one, like where, somebody in one's family has to go to hospital. This happened a couple of weeks ago. It was at no point in the process a scary thing, but it was a sort of, force majeure thing, right? It was just like, this has to happen. Nothing else can happen right now. And all anxieties about whether I'm doing right by different people or whether my book editor is going to be cross with me or whether I owe it to myself to be doing more of this or that, just gone in those moments. There's something very, very interesting about that. Yeah.
It's almost like you get brought back into intimacy with life, that all the other noise just drops. And then you're present in the moment, doing what has to be done. And there's a simplicity in some way to that.
Right. And that makes me think of all the wonderful stuff I've read in the Zen and the Taoist traditions that really highlight this idea that conceptualizing can very usually be a sort of a distancing or a way of putting something in between oneself and reality, and that you're not gonna get there by more and more and more conceptualizing, right? You're not gonna break through you're not going to reason your way out into that other space. You've got to do it by having the edifice of conceptualizing sort of judder and collapse for one reason or another, rather than serve as a ladder.
So isn't that fascinating in a way when we look at, your oeuvre, right? Because it is, right. Let's look at that, and then we can also look at the concept of neurosis, which actually I think you're actually kind of defining here, right? So neurosis.
Sure.
I mean,
whenever I open my mouth.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean you were the definition of neurosis. But you're defining neurosis as conceptions, right? So, and I think speaking about Taoism, I think Lao Tzu put it really nicely. I can only paraphrase, but if you're thinking in the past, you're depressed, and if you're thinking in the future, you're anxious. But if you're, in the present, you're at peace, or something like that.
Right.
And that when we wind ourselves up neurotically, we're creating concepts that make us unhappy. Mm-hmm. But when a disaster, an emergency happens, there's no time for neurotic conceptualizing, because you have to show up for whatever it is that's happening, right? And in some ways, we worry that we're not going to be able to show up, and a disaster happens, and you have to. So you just show up, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I want to put back to you that you have invested in concepts over all of this time. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you've more recently come to a realization about the usefulness of those concepts. And I wonder whether you could say something a little bit more about that, because I do hear you kind of saying, what I'm hearing, right, is that concepts aren't useless. But you're hearing something different.
Yeah. Well, no, they're not useless, but they're not the way to meet life.
They didn't get you to what you were looking to find through them.
Yeah, this gets me onto territory I'm excited to talk about, which is not necessarily a good sign. But I do. Yeah, I increasingly think that maybe my thing, what I can bring to the party or whatever, is the use of concepts, the use of writing, the use of ideas to sort of scope out the limitations of that way of being in the world. So somebody said, I can't remember who, and it might have been me, but after a conversation with somebody else, right? That sort of thing. But I have this thought that has been dropped into my head by somebody that certainly the most recent book I wrote was like a left brain's person's attempt to sort of left brain themselves into the right brain, right? That you can sort of, there's a role for, showing what happens when you follow concepts right to the end. There's especially a role for bringing sort of two conceptual assumptions with which we go through life, but that are completely incompatible with each other, into the air and into reality, into the light, and showing that they can't both be true and maybe are neither true. To put this a lot more elegantly, there's this line that has become a sort of governing one for me, and I've quoted it 1,000 times, so sorry, but from the Zen teacher Peggy Kennett, who was a British-born, America-based, I think, largely Zen teacher, who said that her approach to teaching was not to lighten the burden of the student, but to make it so heavy that he or she would put it down. And I am moved almost like right now, saying that for the 1,000th time, to tears by that thought, because I think it's so powerful for me. Both the idea that putting down a burden is the thing that has mattered to me, and learning how to put down that burden, but also the idea that you could actually help people put down the burden by like really drawing their attention to how heavy the burden was, rather than by just sort of filling their minds with lovely non-duality thoughts about, you know, peace and bliss and things like that. You can actually sort of, you could go there by pointing out that in quite clear and sort of analytical detail what was wrong with the way that we were previously trying to do it. And I think that a lot of, just as an addendum to that, I think a lot of what I'm doing when I'm writing about more mundane subjects like busyness and email and feeling overwhelmed and all the rest of it, planning and trying to control the future, is trying to show people and myself that challenges we've thought of as incredibly hard and incredibly difficult and requiring a huge amount of effort are in fact completely impossible. And that in the shift from really difficult to completely impossible, that's where freedom is, because that's the point at which, if you're like me, you stop beating yourself up about your inadequacy at doing it, because you've seen just how heavy the burden is, and at that point the only sensible thing is to put it down.
It makes me think of something Alan Watts says, you know, which is basically like Satori is boring, like enlightenment is boring, because basically you just realize that everything is exactly what it is. It's just, okay, well, it's just that, right? But it is just that without the weight, ideally.
Right, yes. I think the thing I want to emphasize about this, and it feels very sort of live for me right now, so I don't know how I'll feel about this in like 6 months' time, but is that this is an interesting and somewhat idiosyncratic role for someone who's good with concepts, is to actually sort of, be someone who can meet other people who are also very drawn to concepts and sort of lead them a bit further towards the limitations of that, and then implicitly beyond them. Although I'm always being asked in interview type situations like, okay, so what do you think people should do to live a meaningful life? And I'm always like, that's for you to decide. I'm just showing you that I'm just trying to show you that this sort of edifice of doing everything and becoming perfectly efficient and all this stuff is doomed to fail. If I can help it collapse in your life, then what's there behind those illusions is kind of none of my business.
But do you find yourself, and this is sort of jumping ahead in terms of the questions I wanted to ask, in conflict within yourself between this part that is so well versed in mapping out concepts, arguing, using language, planning ahead, like thinking about sort of Ian McGilchrist's work on the left and right hemisphere roles, and how we're kind of raised in cultures that value that which the left hemisphere is more capable of. So planning, direct thinking, goals, problems, like all of that stuff. That seems to be the territory in which you have excelled in attempting to get further towards the flow, the ineffable, the kind of being in life without being anxious about it. How does that conflict, is there a conflict between those two elements? Does it feel like there are two separate parts? Does it feel like perhaps they're more in concert with one another now that you're kind of reaching to this point where you're taking people beyond the edifice or beneath the edifice, depending on how you want to picture it?
I feel like I can see and make a case for a way in which there needs to be no conflict. That's a slightly separate question from whether there is a conflict in my day-to-day life. And I think in my day-to-day life, I'm definitely sort of taking some steps forward and then taking a step back, in the sense that where my mind goes first, if I'm feeling overwhelmed or too tired or too busy, is towards taking conceptual charge of the situation, and that, doesn't work and doesn't lead to the best writing that I'm capable of and all the rest of it. at the same time, I do on good days, I think there's a sort of a dream scenario here, right? Which is that all the kind of technologies of doing that I've spent so long writing about, time management techniques and ways of thinking about your plans and your schedules and how to get writing done and all the rest of it. Like, as long as you're not trying to find salvation in those, as long as you're not mistaking them for the whole of reality and thinking that they can spare you the sort of all the difficulties and the vulnerability and all the rest, they're brilliant, right? So I'm always trying to navigate this question in sort of not context like this, but sort of certain kinds of interview scenario where people want to say like, well, like, are there still any productivity techniques that you do use? And I'm like, tons of them. Just on my good days, I don't invest them with this idea that they're going to save my soul. And it's like, we're not talking about shutting down the left brain here, right? We're talking about giving it its proper role. So yeah, often, increasingly, I think I'm in terms of my own personal use of these kinds of ideas and on a day-to-day level when it comes to time and managing life's various responsibilities, I think I'm in quite a good place in terms of like using these tools and not seeing them as something more than tools. Mm-hmm. That doesn't feel like a very deep answer to your question.
I think it is, because I think it's expressing the conflict that you're asking about. And I'm going to go Jungian again, which really is not my area. Lisa's going to love this. We interviewed Lisa Marciano from this Jungian Life podcast, and I think I'm kind of moving into a Jungian sphere.
Excellent.
But I tend to be more of a Freud guy. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You're kind of talking a little bit about inferior and superior functioning, right? So people have preferences, whether it's, extrovert, introvert, or sensing and feeling and these sorts of things, or conceptualizing, intellectualizing. I'm not going MBTI, don't worry.
Please don't.
Yeah. But it's like, okay, so you identify an inchoate, anxious core that was there as a child, in a sense. And then you identify a superior functioning, which is conceptualizing, narrating. Right.
Okay.
So then you kind of think, okay, so that's where my muscle is. I'm going to muscle in for the next few decades, not consciously, right? And find out about all the conceptual things that have anything to do with this inchoate core of anxiety. And then with that tool, you find you do well. So whether you get in box 0 or not, you become a successful columnist, you write a few books, you get the job done, you know. And then at the end of it, and I hate to use a Wizard of Oz metaphor, but I'm going to, right? It seems to be like, okay, I go all the way to Oz, and then I find out I really just had to click my shoes together. That it would have been, I didn't need to do all of that. There seems to be kind of a thing, same with the Alan Watts, so you can meditate for years and years and years, and then you open your eyes one day and you say, it's exactly as it was before I started meditating, but somehow I needed to engage in this process. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, I feel like maybe you're learning about your own inferior capacity here. And almost like that speaks a different language to your conceptualizing superior part. And if you have a response, I can leave that there.
Well, just quickly, I want to say that there was some implication in the way you were phrasing it that I might consider the journey to have been wasted time because it got back to where I started. And I am not troubled by that at all, I don't think. Troubled by plenty of things. I feel like it's almost, of course, it's going to have to have unfolded on that route. The other thing I'm interested in, I know a bit about the Jungian stuff, but, I'm certainly no expert. If your superior function is thinking or conceptualizing, in the Jungian model, do you have one specific inferior function, or could it be any of the others?
Well, I mean, if you want to take it pedagogically, yes, you would find a direct... I
want to know what my inferior function ought to be from Jungian.
See, but that's your conceptualizing.
Yeah.
Right? So Jung would probably say,
I can't win.
yes, Jung would say, fuck the model, right? Like, where do you feel inferior? That's it, right? And
right.
and then he would also say, if you completely erase that out or keep leaning on the superior, you'll never let it inform the whole story.
But I also don't know what. Yeah, it's also interesting to wonder what inferior means, because I think I'm definitely like way more of an amateur at my emotional life than I am at my conceptualizing life. But it's not like suppressed in the sense of, it doesn't feel like I don't feel things. It just feels like I'm a extremely untalented at it compared to.
That's exactly it. It's like handedness, Oliver, right? So it's not, there's no judgment in it. It's just like, I'm left-handed with emotions, I'm right-handed with concepts, right?
Yeah.
So when you're trying to get your right hand to talk to your left hand, it doesn't work as well because your left hand speaks a different language, or if you're otherwise handed, right?
Right.
So,
and in many ways, you might end up being much more under the sort of domination and control of the inferior function if you're like, I relate to it much less skillfully than
that's what he says. That it will kind of take a subversive control over you, right? And I guess, but what I'm hearing here, and I don't think it's a waste of time, because I think even Alan Watts is saying you have to do all of that stuff to find, there's no story if Dorothy doesn't go to Oz, it's okay, well, you have the same shoes you had as before, end of the movie, right? It's like,
right. That nice one.
Yeah. But I guess I'm just curious, because it sounds like you are having a realization on that bench that keeps coming up and down between this intellectual and emotional, of like, you can intellectually let it go, but it also sounds like emotionally you have this growing awareness of a letting go, some kind of a weight. Maybe I'm reading that in there, but I just felt like I heard.
Yeah, no, I mean, the way I've always said that to myself and other people is that I'm sort of the conceptualizing function is, it's funny, the conceptualizing ability is, on the one hand, not reality, and not the full expression of reality, as we've been talking about. But on the other hand, in some sense, it's sort of miles ahead of the other faculties in getting to reality, at least as far as it can ever get to reality, right? So I think, please challenge me, but I think what I was understanding on the park bench in that episode that I talked about was, in some sense, the truth. It was the sort of highest understanding of things that in this domain that my conceptualizing was capable of reaching, right? It was a good thing. It was more towards what's real. It wasn't misleading. But yeah, it's like the first 1% of the journey in terms of actually living it, because one's emotions, or my emotions, don't just sort of obey the instructions set down by the intellect.
Well, you're not alone. I mean, it's the central problem of psychotherapy, where people are like, I get it, I understand it, but I still feel this way, right? And that bridge is so,
yeah. No, and I think I do feel that, really, like in a felt way, in an emotional way. I think feeling and emotions might be different for Jungians. I don't know, never mind. But it's much slower going, and it has something to do, just to throw this in there in the spirit of our conversation, maybe, and it has something to do with sort of the subject of authority, this like of claiming some kind of authority or power, and it's got something to do with, like, there's a whole drama, I feel like, in my life that we haven't touched on, and do not need to touch on, believe me, about feeling like I'm the sort of indentured servant of other people, and really resenting it, and in situations where it makes no sense on the external world, right? If I sign up to do some incredibly exciting opportunity that I choose fully of my own volition, and it's a wonderful thing to get to do, and I'm being well remunerated for it, and I could easily have not done it, and it's totally close to my interest, I'm still very prone to sort of resenting the fuckers who are And I've sort of come to understand that pretty recently, really, as being, it's a sort of I go naturally towards adopting some kind of inferior position relative to people like that, which is really odd. And sometimes you're very blessed, as I am really at the moment, with people I work with as editors and others onto whom you want to project this kind of weird, archaic sort of parental thing. And they just, nothing they do reinforces it, right? They're just obviously not in that role. They're and it's great because it makes you realize that you've got this very strange thing as a relic. This idea that when you do things, you're trying to sort of do them as an obligation to please other people. So the reason I brought this up was that the sort of emotional part of following on from that conceptual understanding of what I was trying so futilely to do for so long, it has some big component of like standing on one's own 2 feet and, realizing that in some sense you're the boss of your own life. You're not sort of always just trying to fulfill obligations to other people. Which, by the way, doesn't make you good to deal with, right? Somebody who goes through life trying to fulfill obligations to other people is really annoying because people intuit that you're doing it unhappily, and they're like, "Why the hell did you sign up to do it then?" Right? So it's not actually good for anybody to go through life with that kind of weight of obligation, I don't think.
But it's a great insight because you're talking about projection, right, in a sense, and how other people take a projection that goes way back for you. And I think, and we can't go into it because we have a time for the end of the interview.
But it's so interesting too.
Yeah, but wait, I just want to finish the thought that actually the productivity also, the job to do is an object of projection. So when you think about what is the productivity methodology that's going to fix me,
right?
It's for what? To meet my internalized father's needs, or to meet this projection of how I should show up in the world, or to complete a job. I just wanted to say that.
Right. No, you can absolutely be, just to bring it to my sort of professional world, right? You can absolutely feel obligated to an editor or a audience or something, but you can also feel obligated to a book or an article, and then it totally distorts the whole point of doing it in the first place, which was these are sort of, in the best case, these are sort of these books and articles are expressions of things that I enjoy contemplating, right? And it's like it's you turn it into this thing where it becomes miserable for no reason.
It's a bit fucked up life, isn't it?
Yes.
It's complicated, and then you die. You're like, oh,
keeps us all employed.
yeah. I mean, it gives us something to talk about.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier feelings. How are you feeling right now in this moment, having had hopefully a not interviewee interview?
I'm feeling very warm inside and warm towards you guys. I think this is, I really enjoy this kind of conversation, and it reminds me of things that I think are helpful to be reminded of. And I kind of quite like the challenge of the questions. I can detect a part of me, maybe this isn't a feeling, but I can detect a part of me that feels stymied by the fact that I, on the one hand, don't think I should have been talking about myself so much, and on the other hand, that's the whole topic of the entire conversation, so of course I am. I'm just reporting that. I'm not saying it makes any sense. But no, I could do this for a while longer. I don't know if that's true of any listeners. That seems like a different question, but
we'll find out.
We'll find out, right?
Comment
exactly.
now.
I think people are going to want to know. I think people generally want to know. So on the tail of that, those things that have made you feel in this conversation feel differently, what might that be? Is there kind of an insight, or is there a theme that this conversation has provoked in you that's alive right now?
Well, certainly the framework of, again, this is conceptual, I realize, but, certainly thinking about it in terms of superior and inferior functions, I think is an interesting thing. And it sort of strikes me as true in quite a deep way. That idea that it feels like it gives me again, it's just conceptualization, but it gives me good language for thinking about the place of emotions in my life, right? Not this idea that I think it's easy to assume that if you're not a sort of first and foremost emotional adept, then it's because you don't sort of feel emotions, and that's not my experience at all. So I'm really sort of I like the idea that it's a sort of to understand why you could be sort of the left-handed right-handed thing is very powerful. But I'm giving you a conceptual answer to your emotional question.
I mean, it's a podcast. It's conceptual. It's allowed.
We're not just talking here. We're not doing like embodied somatic work.
And just and
that would be good.
And just one other thing, I also feel like our conversation has brought out for me anyway. This just partly because of just where you started with your like bombshell way in, right? Is that I don't think I've done enough sort of exploring either in my life or in my writing of the sort of the self-worth piece of this. I do come back to it again and again. I'm not sort of, I don't, it's not that I don't go there, but that this is all on some level to do with some sense of sort of existential adequacy. And it's all to do with, and maybe even, sort of saving your soul or something, that sort of, that idea. So I'm, and that sort of taps into all sorts of interesting ideas in Christianity for me that I feel very distant, but fruitful. Yeah.
Thank you.
God, I mean, I would like to start there on a whole nother conversation.
For sure.
Questions of belonging in the world and all of the other stuff that we've spoken around but haven't actually quite landed to. So if you could go back, I'm sure maybe you've been asked this before, but I'm curious to ask this in this context here and now. If you could go back and have a conversation with your 10-year-old self, with young Oliver, and say something to him, what would you feel moved in this moment to say?
I think I would, if I had to say something, I think I would want to communicate the idea that you didn't always have to be trying your best. That it was okay not to be trying your best. I think that one of the ambiguous messages I got in my childhood, through I really sincerely believe nobody's fault, was that you didn't need to achieve any particular worldly standards. It was okay to do your best. And for whatever combination of conditioning, DNA, intergenerational trauma, I don't know, I interpreted that in a way that was not, that was its own sort of oppressive rule. And I spent a long time sort of questioning whether I need to be trying harder, because you need to be able to satisfy yourself that you're doing your best. And so I think it would have been useful to know that it was really okay not to. However, I think communicating a conceptual message would have been exactly the wrong thing, right? I would probably have just wanted to play somehow, to
Nice.
throw ball around or something, or swimming or something.
That's allowed. We can
That's
alter
really
that
moving.
question.
I'm very touched by that answer.
Yeah, I think.
And I find, any question you ask about 10-year-old boys, I just think about my 7-year-old son and how like it's so tempting for me to. I think I have good messages to communicate. I don't think I'm communicating the message like failure is not an option if you don't get straight A's we will withdraw our love for you. And I don't think I communicate bad messages, but I do want to communicate messages with like little lectures when I do understand that is not the point. So that's my challenge. It's like, no, just do the Lego with him.
Yes.
Like, even if the message that you want to inform him of is a really good one. Yeah.
Well, given those different styles of communication, childlike and adult, what do you think your 10-year-old self might have to say or demonstrate or play with you if he were to see you now?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but in terms of what I mean, I think it would be playfulness, right? I'm not sure how playful I ever was as a child, and I'm not sure how playful I still was by the age of 10. But yeah, I was doing things at that age that definitely held the beginnings of like my work. I was making little newspapers and all this stuff, but I was doing it, I think, for the truest of the reasons that I had for doing it, which was that sort of joy in, it was probably more like 13 or 14 when, rather than 10, when the early sort of desktop publishing software was widely available. And I was just, the idea that you could both do the writing and like present things with headlines and in columns, just like, I was just
print shop. Did you print shop on your computer?
Blew my mind. What was it? No, it was an Amstrad. It was, oh God, literally the company that made these computers doesn't exist anymore, let alone the computer. Actually, I've just recently got back into, I feel like Jung would be proud of me in this respect. I studied the mechanisms inside the pop-up books that I had and tried to replicate them. And I've just got, this is one of the great blessings of YouTube. There are some amazing tutorials for basically anything, as you know, but including making pop-ups.
Oh.
So I have like literally within reach, I've got my craft knife and
wow,
pieces of card. And that is like, that's the closest I get to that kind of, Jung in his sand pit or whatever it was.
Look out for Oliver Burkeman's new children's pop-up book.
No. They must not turn into professional goals. That's kind of like,
keep it as play.
That's the point. Play. Yeah, got it. Never going to see him.
Oh, well, so I feel like this is kind of doing the opposite of everything.
We don't have to ask that question.
I want to, actually. All right. Let's bring you back into the world of Oliver Burkeman being interviewed about his professional life with all of these, pre-prepared questions. Because I think we could get to a different answer given the journey we've just taken. If you were going to offer folks who are watching or listening either some advice or maybe even a question to dwell with, what would that be in this moment, given the conversation we've just had?
Okay, look, I got a problem here, which is that I collect these questions and there are sort of 4 or 5 that resonate really deeply for me all the time. And they just flood into my mind when you ask this question, right? Whether or not they're specifically relevant to what I was just saying. So I realize this is my thinking function, like, striding back into, and so I'm sort of trying to connect it to that issue of like that question of play and like, one is like, what have you done in your life and what do you do in your life that you do for itself in the deepest sense? And, could you do a bit more of that? The other thing that's just coming up for me of the sort of, out of this sort of rucksack of such questions that mean a lot to me is relating to earlier parts of our conversation, I think. something that I attribute to Bruce Tift, who I'm sure you've encountered his writing somewhere, but he's a sort of psychotherapist and Buddhist who's wrote a great book called Already Free. Anyway, I'm sure it's not just him, but he says, like, what is it like to think about the aspect of your character that you sort of most want to change, and to imagine that it's sort of being with you in some shape or form to the very end of your life. And my only problem there is I can think of so many things I'd like to change. But say,
bring a crowd with you.
take one manifestation of it, which would be like how I'm sort of, I have difficulty being flexible in terms of the rhythms of time and changing plans and things like that. And I like to sort of know what's happening. And when it doesn't, I get thrown, and I'm way better than I was. But say in some way, this sort of thing remained vestigially until the end of my life. That's such a relaxing thought. And actually that's the beginnings of being free from it as well, because that's just like, okay, that's just part of who I turned out to be. And it doesn't need a huge amount of, one doesn't need to go into war against it. So I guess the question there is like, what does it feel like to imagine taking the thing you struggle with and imagining that it would be there in some form for the rest of your life? I think this is why I'm at the moment. I keep running into people at the moment who sort of seize me by the collar metaphorically and tell me that I've got to read lots of books about the Enneagram, and that's probably a sign that I should. And I've read a little bit, and we don't need to talk about it necessarily. But I just think this basic notion, there's something very liberating in the idea that maybe there are certain aspects of our personalities that just belong to types and are never going to be changed. And it's great in relationships as well to be like, yep, that's just who that person is. And
absolutely.
And like, if you get if it gets kind of intellectual weight because it's put in a book about the Enneagram, then great. Like, but it's just like, there's so much, how much life could we have if we were not trying to change the ultimately difficult to change parts of ourselves and other people?
Well, it's the most profound form of self-acceptance, I think, which I know is also a cliche, but I think people do want to strangle the parts of themselves they don't like and want to grow the parts that they do like, and that's just generally not the solution.
Right.
But in closing, I'm going to alter this a little bit, but we just got a couple short ones to finish with. Generally, we ask people to, if they have a favorite film, book, recommendation, that sort of thing. But because you have pretty much read the gamut of psychology, self-help world, would you be able to pick maybe one or two texts that you personally found the most helpful in whatever way you want to say, whether it's how you manage productivity? You could pick one of each, like a productivity one and more of a existential caring one. It's entirely up to you, but one or two texts that really spoke to you deeply.
Yeah, again, my problem is like
Your
immediately a list of 20 comes to my mind. But I mean, the ones that would be, to being very honest about that, one would certainly be sort of all the work of James Hollis, a Jungian psychotherapist, but especially his book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. I think it's a bad
We just
title.
talked about that yesterday.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful book that came to me at a very important time. I think it's sort of not the greatest title because it implies that in order to pick it up, you've got to accept that you're already in the second half of your life.
We still talk about that too.
Yeah. Obviously, in the Jungian sense that he means it, that I think it probably happens to some people in their early 30s. Happened to me in my early 40s. I think that the legitimate claim to be in that midlife place. And that was remains a very important book to me for lots of reasons. But I mean, one is just that basic. Partly he's just as a wonderful writer and sort of generous, humorous, deep writer, but also just that sense that like you can have lived in a way up to midlife that was the right way to live for that part of life, and it can also not be the right way to go forward. I think that's an important, really important thought. You can edit this so there isn't like 20 minutes of trying to think of which other titles
I like
to
that you take time to think about it, though.
nominate.
I think it's good.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of, well, I mean, there was literally a blog post. It's just a blog post that was written years ago by my friend Susan Piver, the meditation teacher, called Getting Things Done by Not Being Mean to Yourself.
I could do with that.
Which was extremely significant for me. And I feel like I've quoted it so many times that I haven't really talked to her about this in detail, but she must think it's quite weird. I go on and on and on about this one blog post she wrote. And she's written like plenty of excellent books, both before and since. But just recounting a day when she experimented with this incredibly radical question, like, what would I like to do today instead of what must I do? And finding not only that it's obviously a much friendlier way to relate to oneself, but that you get most of the chores done anyway, because, you know, all the things you were pushing yourself to do get done, because actually you're not a terrible, awful person who will only, you know, eat crisps and watch movies if you're not being hard on yourself. You actually do want to meet your commitments and stay on top of your email and pay your bills, right? And you don't need to sort of reinforce that notion that you need to be whipped in order to do it. So I guess that's more explicitly productivity focused. And then I'll just throw in, I tend to keep these ones that really make a big difference, just very, very literally close to my self here. So I'm just looking on the shelf behind me. Well, here's the other one that I mentioned just before, which is Already Free, Buddhism Meets Psychotherapy on the Path of Liberation by Bruce Tift, which I think is a great book.
Lots of Zen Buddhist texts coming in there. Just a quick question. Do you know of Joe Confino's work, The Way Out is In, with Brother Phaphu? It's a beautiful podcast out of Plum Village.
I don't. I feel like I know Joe Confino from an utterly other life. At The Guardian, right? We're talking about the same person.
Yeah,
here,
Sustainable Business at The Guardian. I have a feeling that you might enjoy that. It's a really beautiful podcast.
Great, thank you.
Anyway. So I suppose we should.
I think we should wrap it up. Yeah. Kind of don't want to. It's been a really good one. I like the...
We've really enjoyed it. Hopefully, it hasn't been too painful for you.
No, I've loved it. It's the listeners I wonder about. That's a terrible thing to say. Sorry, I don't mean to. I don't mean to undermine the brilliance of your podcast. I think you've got a great way of doing this. I'm always a little bit suspicious of the idea that anyone wants to know anything about my inner life, but that's an interesting thing in itself. I get that.
We're going to find out.
Yeah, it's our first season. It hasn't gone out there yet, so we're going to find out if anybody's interested in these people's inner lives. I think people are generally curious. And
I mean, I am.
I've enjoyed all of them.
Yeah. There's a podcast I want to do where people who give advice, me, but other people, writers who do stuff in this are interviewed alongside their spouses or partners. Because I feel like so many of the questions that I get asked, not in this context, but in others, like, have you really changed and become way less anxious and overwhelmed and stressed, are not best answered by me.
It sounds really cringy.
That's amazing.
It's like Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Yes.
It would have about 6 episodes, and then it would cause so many problems and divorces that it would never repeat.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say with our mothers.
Yeah.
Oh, that's another one. That's another
God.
one. Yeah.
Yes, no, let's not do that. Family members, probably even riskier than partners.
Let's see
and
if
you
this
can't
flies.
divorce your parents.
No.
I mean, let's not go there. Right, well, anyway, if people want to find out more about you and also about your forthcoming book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, also The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, also Help How to Become Slightly Happier and Get a Bit More Done, all of that great stuff, where are the best places to find you?
The books are all available wherever you buy books, and my website is oliverburkeman.com, which has details of those and of my email newsletter, the Imperfectionist. And signing up for that is the one thing that if people want to do something to stay in touch with my things, that I'd ask them to do that.
Brilliant.
Oliver, thank you so much for taking the time to show up with us today. It was a real pleasure to have you.
It really
I've
was.
really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Thank you very much.
I'm so glad.